I'm going to be doing this video and I've gone through half of the discussion. So I may be sending you some individual input, but basically I'm going to be doing the video because I found some interesting patterns as I went through the first 20 pages of the discussions. Here were some of the issues that were brought up. This is Marshall, Kayla, Michelle W, and Michaela H, and Mallory, or maybe not your original, but at least you commented. So whatever people said, that's what I went for. Michaela, and then we have Bellarmino Chavez. So we got 3 Spanish teachers. We got Marshall and Michelle and Bellarmino are Spanish teachers. It's very interesting teaching a foreign language in America and teaching the predominant language in America. I was thinking it's probably just an idea just comes to mind, that teaching a foreign language or a language in the country where the people, where that language is used every day, I think is going to be a lot more stressful. In some ways, the students will get more exposure. Just like if you, Michelle, or if you and Marshall and Bellarmino, I'm going to try to say that right, Bellarmino. If all 3 of you were to be teaching Spanish in Spain, now of course I get to talking and everything here is going to make noise, so I'm going to kill that. But if you were teaching in Spain, there'd be more pressure because people would expect your students to speak Spanish, and there'd be pressure for them to work and to be more fluent. But it's a little easier, I think, here because I know when I was studying Spanish or we studied German or foreign languages, it's kind of a fun thing to do. There's not a lot of pressure. I'm not going to run into people outside. They're going to question me. And so the difference is you don't have to know the language to survive. Whereas ESL, in this environment, you have to know the language to survive. If you taught Spanish in Spain or Mexico, and the kids and whoever you're teaching it to didn't know Spanish, their survival would depend on their ability to pick up the language. So I think that's a little different. I don't know if that's a big deal to you, but it means the audience is different and the expectations are more graphic if you must pick up the language because it's critical. Now, several things came up in here. Oh, Kayla's in here. There was a mention in 2 or 3 of these that the push-in program versus pull-out. And I know several of you said, well, that you didn't even know all these other versions. But let's face it, pull-in, push-out, ESL, and a sheltered workshop or a newcomer also are really the 4 or 5 basic types of programs. What I think is interesting is that some teachers need to have their own room. This is very important for you. Imagine if you didn't have your own little office and you didn't even have your own classroom, but you basically function by going into other people's classrooms. I think that would be stressful. You wouldn't have control. And I don't think it helps the ego. I mean, if you're a teacher, you want to be equal to other teachers. You don't want to be kind of like a para in their room. I mean, you do have a full degree and stuff, so you want to be honored for that. And also a push-in requires very careful, what I call coordination, collaboration between the main classroom teacher and the ESL teacher, or whoever's going in. Good collaboration. I call it co-teaching would be a better deal. Another issue came up. I'm just going through all these as I took notes over these. Is several of you mentioned that some people only get 20 minutes with the ESL English language learner or EL learner, only get 20 minutes a day. Yeah, that's not enough. And there has to be a priority. Kayla Kayla, you mentioned something about time limits and that ESL instruction may be cut down because of the schedule. And because that's the language that the students must master in order to be successful in all the other classes, it should be the priority. I'm not sure what can be done about that, but that struck me as something very important. Another one, and I'm kind of just hitting these as they come to mind, was the idea of the paraeducators conducting the interventions. And I can't remember, I know the 20 minutes came up a lot, but where was that? In April, you mentioned this in your comment, is that on the paras doing language intervention, and shouldn't this be the ESL teachers? Or so that's something that I think is a kind of an important issue. The amount of time for ESL instruction, the collaboration between the ESL teacher and the other teachers, however the program is conducted, and the use of paras. And paras are not supposed to be teachers, they're supposed to be helpers. And obviously you feel the intervention is important that it be conducted with people that have more experience, I guess, or professional training. Also, I didn't know what Pashto is, and Marshall mentioned that, and that is Pashtun. I knew what Pashtun was, the people in Afghanistan. So I looked it up and I said, oh, Pashto comes from Pashtun. So that's the language there. And you do have some students there, Marshall, from Afghanistan, apparently in Kearney. There was this sentiment that most of you agreed that you need more professional development for regular classroom teachers, that ELs are all the teachers' students are all the students. The ELs aren't just your students, and regular classroom teachers have their students. I've seen this many times. The whole comment about ownership or they're my students. There aren't some students that aren't your students. They're all your students. And that really has got to affect kids when they hear people say, no, you're not my student. You need to go to that room. Okay, so I mentioned some of those issues. Here's something Marshall brought up, and this is for all ESL people. How do you teach regular classroom teachers to check the English learners for comprehension? If you had some experience of people overseas, in some cultures, people will always say, yes, I understand, because to say no is very disrespectful to the teacher. And a lot of kids, if they don't understand, they don't want to be embarrassed by being singled out or being, last thing, if you don't speak the language, is you want people to speak to you more and pursue you and ask questions, say, well, do you understand this mathematical formula? You're going to act like either you understand it, or you're going to say yes, or you're just not going to say anything. So this is a very important point, and you talk about professional development, is how do regular classroom teachers phrase questions. And I would say they probably have to make sure they have the students do the problems if it's a math, or do some activity where they demonstrate they understand what it is. A related question to that is this English only expression, and I saw it in several of yours. I'm trying to make sure I get everybody straightened out on here. The English only, I think, was mentioning that. Here we go. English only, Michaela, you mentioned that. And then I'm empathetic to that. You're not trying to oppress people or suppress their native language, but you're trying to encourage them to use the target language in the classroom. I think a grain of salt. You have to allow people some access to their native tongue. If they don't understand, they may say, no entiendo. Like in Spanish, you say, I don't understand, entender. And so what I would watch out for is people that, and you mentioned it in talking about the textbook, about people telling the parents not to use their native language at home, or telling kids in school, like in the hallway or something, you must use English at all times. That is not right. That's not acceptable. Okay, there was a principal who got a lot of trouble in Kansas City. He was yelling at kids, telling them to speak English only, not in the classroom, but I mean in the hallways, period. And that goes back to the old history of kids being spanked if they spoke their native language. This is what they did at Indian schools when they took kids away from the Native American families, and they basically tried to destroy their culture. And they did that by prohibiting their language. Okay, I'm getting some, now something Marshall brought up, and I think, because 3 of you are language teachers in this first group, is that promoting foreign language, I'd written this down, promoting foreign language study creates an environment that is accepting of diversity. I think schools should, be very excited about teaching Spanish. All students that are taking the Spanish class should have a positive environment. And my gosh, to have actual native speakers in the school is even a better deal. Okay. You're right, Marshall, about heritage instruction. This is very important. And I just want to repeat this. To be accepting of the native language of the ELs, and basically for the purpose of diversity, accepting the language of whoever's in your school, even if they speak fluent English, that we should want to learn about their culture and their language. So that's a very big issue. And so I like the idea of having a multicultural club and having food and getting, maybe celebrating some, everybody talks about Cinco de Mayo or Los Posadas, is it Posadas in the Christmas celebration. Some of this you can do more in schools and less depending on if it's parochial school, but anything is culture. I mean, celebration is part of culture. And so I don't think you can take, my personal opinion, you can't just try to prohibit and not talk about religious holidays. You're not promoting the religion, you're talking about the culture. I have a quote I want to give you that I made up, is that you cannot appreciate a culture or a language unless you seek beauty in it. Now, I happen to be, my personal feelings about this is I love Miguel de Cervantes and Don Quixote. I think it's one of the most beautiful novels. Now, I've not read it in Spanish. I've read parts of it, stories and stuff, but the whole idea, it was like the first great novel written by humankind. And so it's extraordinary. And I'm sure you couldn't read the whole thing because it's an incredibly large book. But the idea of Don Quixote, this silly man who's reading books on being a knight, like in the old days, and he wants to be a very genteel knight. And what do they call that stuff? I've been drinking too much coffee today. But the idea of the court, the way the knights were, and they had to treat women a certain way, and they had to be chivalry, that's the word. They had to show chivalry. They had to be honorable. They had to fight for the poor and the oppressed. Now we know in reality they didn't do that, but think about it. Marshall, you're in Spain right now. My gosh, you can go to Salamanca, or where was that place where, not Avila, although that'd be a great place to go too, Teresa of Avila. But you can go to where Cervantes, it'll dawn on me after I quit talking, but you can go and maybe see the windmills or something that was used for that. And so any of you don't know about Don Quixote, great novel about kind of and I'm kind of getting older myself, a guy that's kind of losing it, and he's wanting to be a great knight, but he's just an old man and he doesn't have long to live, but he lives his life in this dream world where he's protecting poor women, and he's fighting monsters, and he's stopping all kinds. And it all is kind of silly, but the sentiment is that it's an extraordinary story about hope in the face of hopelessness, I guess is how I would say it. So Marshall's a really good resource, and so is let's see, our other two, Michaela and also Bellarmino, in teaching Spanish and your cultural background. Now, of course, we have ESL students in here because Bellarmino is from Los Angeles, and he was an ESL student, and you taught in Houston. My gosh, you have such a depth of experience. I would like to consider this. Also, Mallory. And Mallory, you mentioned you work with a little Chinese girl, been adopted. And that really, you're getting the joy of this little girl learning, and you're the person making it happen. And that's what makes teaching fun. You know, teaching should be laughter and joy, you know. And I wanted to mention, because Mallory, I knew this from before, that you had worked at the Santee Sioux Reservation up in northern Nebraska. And you dealt with culture, and we can't really talk about ESL. We don't talk about culture and accepting culture, because language is the manifestation of culture. If you don't have language, you don't have any way to say what things are, what they mean, or can show the sentiments of the mind. I'm seeing if there's anything else I wanted to talk about. And I think it's very important to be very, oh, Diego's a Spanish teacher, is that right? Did I have Diego in there? Okay, I'm sorry if I'm getting a little confused, because I can't read my own writing very well anymore. But some of you commented, and some of you actually made your entries in here. I'll get to you, and I get to the next part. I can't read 40 pages and try to keep all this straight in my head. But I wanted to give you feedback, and I really appreciate the others that made comments. I'm trying to get anything that's valuable in here. So we got the issue of how much time priority of having time to work with the ESL English learners, and that we shouldn't be cutting that time down due to schedule. I think Kayla, you mentioned about using visuals with the students, and I didn't write that down, but it was obvious, of course, that, and I think all of you people need to see and experience something other than just hear it, because when the second language is used, it makes it difficult. Now, Michelle, there is something that I wanted to mention this, how people grade, and all of you have to think about how you grade your students. And you mentioned that some of the people, when you're doing these interviews at Alliance for Career, that some of the people may have cut down the grades because students made mistakes, and they're ESL students now, English learners. And sometimes you got to really watch for that, because people say, I think you have to cut them some slack. Do they get the essentials? Yeah, they may say a word that's non-standard English, or make some mistake, or be a little incomprehensible, but you got to take them where they are and move them along. So if you judge them strictly on literally one thing equals another, and you don't give them any slack, then obviously your ESL students are not going to be get as good a grades. Do you give grades on effort? I think to some extent you do, and each of you has probably worked this out. I mean, literally, a thing called fair may not be fair if it expects more than a student's capable of, reasonably capable of. So I just want to mention that. You talked about somebody giving slightly lower grades, and I think we all face that. I face it all the time. You know, I'm not a tough grader. You know it. If you don't know it, you're going to be very happy. But the thing is, we need to think about these. One other thing Michaela mentioned is about having, and it was mentioned in the book, about mixing levels. If you have groups of students in different levels, it can be very tough to give instruction if you have too wide a range, and especially in ESO, you think you would be able to get them within a certain range. So I like differentiation. In the other book I used on this last year, I talked about differentiation. But differentiation is to be used sparingly. You don't try to take every class and turn it into a 5-level, you know, parking garage where everybody performs at certain levels and stuff. You may have a general concept of that, but on a daily basis, you may drive yourself crazy trying to do that. I hope I've made some sense for you. You all gave very fine, detailed discussions, and as I mentioned, some other people, I mentioned about talking about, I know April and I think Mallory, you made some comments about English only and use of paras. So these are all important issues too. Okay, I'm going to stop right there, and then I'm going to read the next set, and then I'm going to share, of course, all these with you. If this is a good format for you, that's fine. I feel like there's too many things. If I just reply to you individually, then, now if you just ask me a question, that's no problem. But I want to do these videos because I want to share the richness of the discussion with all of you. Thank you. And I didn't see anything that would embarrass your district or anything. Obviously, we all have different opinions about how things should be done.